a good time to get started if you're ready.
Sure.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 6 of the South Dakota Forest Health Workshop Series. My name is Tony Seidel, your moderator, and today we are joined with Dr. John Ball, who will talk about our abiotic damages, often overlooked stressors to South Dakota trees, and what we as landowners and land managers can do to promote healthy urban forests in our communities. Your video and microphone capabilities have been turned off to save bandwidth. We ask that you please keep them that way. Any questions you have can be placed in the chat box when we have some time planned at the end of our presentation to address those live here. As an equal opportunity provider, the Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources encourages your participation. This workshop is being recorded and we're going to place it on the department's YouTube channel here shortly. Society of American Foresters and International Society of Arboriculture credits are available for attending this live workshop. Please place your credentials in the chat box today, and those will get reported for credits. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Ball.
All right. Well, thank you, Tony, and I'll get us started here. Share. All right. Well, we should be good to go, everyone. And by the way, this will be part 1. Part 2 will be next month's, because there's so many abiotic stresses out there that damage trees. And I'm going to cover some of the basics here to begin with, and then we'll kind of move on. But, you know, we think a lot about insects. We think a lot about diseases. But we forget either the underlying cause of a lot of our problems, in other words, why the trees are susceptible to insects and diseases, or just in themselves are those abiotic disorders that occur out there. And just for definition, a disorder is any abnormal growth or development due to a non-living agent. So, for example, soils. That's certainly non-living in the sense that it's not a pathogen, though obviously soils may contain pathogens. Mechanical damage. Now, certainly that's going to be due to a human being, which is living, but we kind of exclude ourselves from this category of living. So anything we do to trees, unlike insects, are considered abiotic. How's that? And of course, weather-related, allelopathic problems, pollution, chemical damage, and we're going to focus a lot on chemical in part 2. So a lot of herbicide issues will be brought up during then. Water availability, we're going to chat about today, stem girdling roots. These are all good examples of abiotic stresses. Now, the biotic ones are the living organisms. That would be our insects, mites, nematodes, other animals, though next time we will spend a little time talking about deer as well. And then, of course, our diseases. By that, our fungal pathogens, bacteria, viruses, and that. Some of those which we've already covered in previous episodes of this series. But, you know, just to give you some examples, soil and site problems, shallow soils. We certainly have all seen a lot of spruce flipping over this summer. During those major wind events. Now, the wind events in themselves are going to cause trees to fail, but you add shallow soils and spruce, and that's a perfect combination. We also have physical and mechanical injury, roots that come up to the surface and people hit them with lawnmowers. We get frost cracks due to rapid temperature changes. And this picture to your right showing that young maple, and that is showing southwest disease, where we're getting that cracking along the southwest side of the tree. And the same tree is in both pictures here. The picture to the left is showing you kind of standing on the west side of it. And you can see that that splits there. And the reason for that, and the reason it's called southwest disease, is the splitting occurs in the wintertime because of the intense sun, which warms up that bark. And when the sun sets, that bark temperature drops, whatever the ambient air temperature is. You know, it might be 20 degrees, it might be minus 20 degrees. And that rapid temperature change causes these splits to occur. That's why on young maple trees, one of the things we strongly encourage people to do is to put tubes around them for the wintertime. And that a little of a air gap between the tube and the trunk, and that'll prevent those rapid temperature changes from occurring. And once trees get more than about 3 or 4 inches in diameter, certainly 4, the bark is corky and thick enough that we no longer have to worry about these temperature changes. But if you look at a lot of maples, particularly the silver maples or the Freeman maples in South Dakota, you can almost use them as a compass. That split is going to be on the southwest side of the tree. And the reason for that is it's a form of winter injury. And then we get a lot of others that are kind of the unusual ones that I'm just going to mention before we get into the heart of today. And this was probably one I don't see very often. And if you notice the trees in this picture, these are ponderosa pines, and they have that discoloration to them. Now, interesting enough, I've seen that discoloration before from road salts. And with road salts, it's not the salt per se. By that I mean the potassium, the sodium, and that's used. It's actually the chloride that causes most of the damage in de-icing salt. So it doesn't matter whether you say, well, I'm going to switch from sodium chloride to potassium chloride. You still have chloride, and chloride is really the damaging agent in most cases for road salts. Well, I looked at these and I thought, my gosh, they have the same injury as road salt, but they're pretty far from a road. Well, what was happening here is the guy was frequently emptying his hot tub right over those trees. And of course, that water had a lot of chlorides in it. And because of that, he was actually causing chloride damage on his pine trees just from that. And I've seen that too with pools that are leaking just enough that we get chlorides dumped into an area like this. And now that he's stopping, chlorides will fade fairly quickly and hopefully the trees will recover. But hot tub damage is not something you typically think of when you think of tree abiotic stresses. But winter burn, boy, did we see that this year. You looked at a lot of arborvitae, a lot of spruce, a lot of pine, particularly the small ones. And there was just tremendous amount of winter burn on these trees. And I might remind everyone watching us today is now is the time to be watering your trees to help reduce winter injury. It's not as that old myth is, well, I'm going to water them just before freeze up. Putting water down for them in late October, early November is not a great help. Putting water to them now is. Preparing for winter requires the plant to expend energy. And it's only going to have that energy if the plant is healthy. And it's only going to be healthy if it's getting adequate water. So as a reminder, if you want your trees to go through winter better than they did last year, water them starting now. Don't wait until October. By that point, it's too late. Well, that's kind of setting the stage for what I'm going to focus on part one of this. And we're going to spend a lot of this on winter related problems. Mostly the shoulders of the year, the falls and the springs. So we'll just call them weather, but it's really focusing more on our winter weather, the weather that's coming up and what sort of damage that does to trees. This is a typical picture I would get this year. Why is my spruce dying? Now, first of all, your spruce isn't dying, it's dead. Once they've lost all their needles, there's no coming back from this one. But I got a lot of these. And, well, why are my spruce dying, particularly the young spruce? And it's usually due to one of two reasons. Either it's weather / climate, but really weather, or it's due to soils. Trees planted in low areas and spruce do not like wet feet. And so I've seen them fail for that. And we do have some areas that have experienced flooding last year and this year. And then also our weather. It's just been too darn hot this summer and too darn dry in many areas. So it's kind of those twin evils. Spruce are what I refer to as a Goldilocks tree. They don't like too much water and they don't like too little water. The water has to be in the right amount. So despite the fact we utilize spruce throughout the state, and they are reasonably tough trees, they are a little picky when it comes to choosing sites. And I've seen numerous examples where a row is going from a top of a hill into the depression and back up. And quite often you see the trees in the depression dying because they're getting too much water. The trees at the very top dying because they're not getting enough. And the trees along the slope where the water is just right, back to the Goldilocks, you find those are doing just fine. And so we need to pay a little bit more attention to site. But the other one, of course, is our temperatures and our precipitation. And so that's really what I'm going to be focusing on today. And climate change gets to be an overused term. It has relevance to today's discussion, and certainly climate is changing. Climate does. We do not have climates that stay steady for long time periods. But too often, this is being looked upon as, oh my goodness, are we going to become the palm capital? As our temperatures warm and our winters warm, and they are we going to be moving into a warmer plant hardiness zone? In other words, are we going to be able to plant more trees, different trees, than we do now? And the short answer is no. While we are seeing temperature changes over time, we're going to be subject to more temperature fluctuations. And so when we're starting to choose plant materials, the item we often use to decide what to plant is the plant hardiness zone map. And that is throughout the entire country. And if you look at South Dakota in the center there, we're in zone 4 for the most part. And so when you're selecting plant materials, one of the things you look at, and almost every tree you see in a catalog will have a zone next to it. And that zone means the farthest north you can grow it. That if it says zone 4, you can grow it as far north as zone 4, and you may be able to grow it in zone 5 and zone 6, but certainly not in zone 3. So we use this information to base a lot of our decisions as to what to plant in the state, that it should be hardy to zone 4. But where did we come up with this map? Well, it's kind of interesting. It started out back in 1927, and the original map had only 8 zones, and they updated it in 1938. But what was interesting, this map was developed in Boston. And as you might recall, back in 27, it wasn't easy to travel this country as much as it is now. And so folks in Boston just kind of guessed, well, I wonder what would grow there. I wonder what would grow there. And it's certainly gotten better over the years, but there's the very first map. The zones weren't quite the same in terms of numbering. Notice in South Dakota, we actually crossed 1, 2, 3, 4 different zones in this. Now we're down to a single zone. And again, they were kind of guessing at temperatures, and you get into the middle part of the country there. And their zones got better. Notice the map here that we were actually zone 3, according to the Arnold Bream. Now, what was interesting is zone 3 was considered minus 35 to minus 20. And that still fits today, but they've just reordered the numbers. And so now we're really a zone 4 plant, as you see today with the USDA plant hardiness map. But this map is based upon only one factor. That's based upon the minimum temperature of the coldest month. Now, that's typically January, but occasionally is February as well. And so we're making our planting decisions. In other words, what we're going to plant, and it's all usually on plant hardiness, on that one factor: how cold does it get? Now, certainly that's important. It does keep us from planting coconut palms in South Dakota, but when you get into the plains here, which are subject to more temperature extremes, it's not telling us everything we need to know. So we, are the most part, are in zone 4 in South Dakota. And I realize we have people here from North Dakota watching this, and there we get into zone 3 locations. And Nebraska, we get into zone 5s. And Minnesota kind of tracks very similar to us, as well as Wyoming, but minus 20 to minus 30. So you think, okay, well, that is kind of our typical winters. Are winters getting warmer? Are we going to be able to plant more material? Well, no. Now, yes, our winters are getting warmer. And if you can look at this weather data that I've showing here from Sioux Falls, you'll notice that going back into 1971 and 1980 and that, we tend to stay right where zone 4 is. Our minimum temperature was that minus 20, minus 30. And then notice that as we got into the 2000s, look at how many of our winters were warmer than that. Minus 8, minus 7. But we still have those winters that get down to minus 30. So when people say, well, our winters are getting warmer, we should be able to plant materials that are in zone 5 reliably. The answer is no. And we don't see that changing in the foreseeable future. That even though our winters are getting warmer, we still have those winters that will drop to the -30, and they will occur every decade several times. And because of that, we still have to make sure that we remain planting zone 4 plant materials. In fact, I could argue that you may want to even consider zone 3 plant materials more, and I'll explain that here in a moment. But certainly zone 5 materials, worthy of trial in town where we've got those little heat islands, but our milder winters are not really helping us, because with our climate change, we are getting slightly warmer winters. But our problem is, and this is a lot of the damage that we saw this year, is greater seasonal fluctuations. And that's really what we talk about with climate variability. It's the way the temperature fluctuates, above or below what our long-term average is. And I'm sure we're all seeing this more and more. A good example, pagoda dogwood. I track when these plants bloom every year, and they've bloomed as early as May 17th and as late as June 14th. That's almost a month difference. And we've all seen springs that are colder than normal or warmer than normal, and we've seen it change from a day to day. Snow on chokeberries. Took that picture in May. And that's our problem, is that we're getting these winter events in spring, and the plants are already coming out of dormancy. You can see here it was already in bloom, and it snowed, and that snow stuck for a while. Well, what we're seeing really then is what we've typically called winter injury, but we're seeing it in the spring, and we're also seeing it in the fall. A lot of the magnolias were frosted out this year. And why? They were blooming, and then we got that cold snap. And then we also get the other side of the coin. Here's snow on arrowwood viburnums in October. And so our shoulders of winter, the fall and the spring, the Octobers, Novembers, March, and April, those, and even May, those are the months we're actually experiencing most of what we call winter injury, when the plants are beginning to get ready for winter and are not fully prepared for cold temperatures, and also when plants are coming out of dormancy and are no longer able to take those cold temperatures. That's where we're seeing the damage. They're prepared for these cold temperatures in midwinter. The -20s, -30s, they can handle. What they can't handle is the temperature fluctuations that we're now experiencing on a greater extreme in our springs and our fall. This was very common this year. And this is one of the calls that I went out to. One of the districts had me stop by and look at trees. And again, I could repeat this at numerous other locations. That what happened is they said, hey, could you go out and take a look at these trees? They're leafed out, but then the leaves died and they're producing more leaves. Well, this last spring in this area, this is down near Sioux Falls, I think this is Hutchinson County. But what happened is we hit 90 degrees at the end of April. 90 degrees. That really started pushing growth on the maples. And then it dropped to 20 degrees a week later. And plants that were breaking dormancy right at that point, where they had a lot of tender tissue out, were wilting and dying. This occurred mostly on maples and on honey locusts. The number of calls I got on honey locusts that did not break bud this year, had a lot of dieback to it, was just amazing. And the reason for this is trees that broke bud much sooner, and we do have some that did that. Some of the lindens, for example, they're one of the first to leaf out. Their leaves had toughened up enough that they could take the 20 degrees. And of course, the other trees, such as oaks, that didn't break bud until May, they were fine as well. But it was the maples and the honey locusts that started breaking bud just at that time when the warm temperatures really encouraged it more. And then we had that cold snap, and the leaves were still just very, very tender. Perfect example here. And on plants, you'd say, well, what was going on here? Butterflies magnolia. Butterfly, you can see this is dead to the ground. This was just coming out of dormancy. It's on the south side of a building. At that same period, we had those warm temperatures end of April, and then it dropped and it just killed these flat back. In the background is a bald cypress on South Dakota State University campus. And it's just fine. And we've got a number of these on campus. It's just fine. Why were they fine? They didn't break bud until mid to the end of May. And so they were still in dormancy at that time period. And despite the fact that we don't think of them as a hardy plant, and I'll admit they're a little temperamental, they stayed dormant far later than the magnolia, which is considered hardy. This one is. And so they escaped that cold weather damage in May, which unfortunately hit the magnolia. And that's kind of an important thing to remember in all this. Red osier dogwood, for example, it'll tolerate minus 200 degrees in January. We don't see that in South Dakota. We don't see that really anywhere. That was done in chambers to prove that it could grow, survive that cold. So minus 30, minus 40, they just laugh at. But that same plant in April can only take 15 degrees. And if its growth has been pushed by a warm early April, it's even more susceptible to cold damage. So we do get cold injury on dogwoods, and you'd think that's a plant that we shouldn't because of temperature fluctuations once again. And I'm going to give you one more example of this, and it's our Norway maples. They're fairly popular in the state. When you get up to North Dakota, they get fewer and far between. But even there, they do have some in the southern part of their state and along the eastern edge more. And in Minnesota, all the way up to the Twin Cities, we have, and certainly in Iowa and Nebraska. Getting out in Wyoming, less so just because of the dryness. But the Crimson King Norway maple is considered a zone 4 plant. Zone 4 to zone 7 is considered its sweet spot. But when we look at how cold it can tolerate temperatures, and at the left side is how cold of temperatures the plant can take. And if you take a look, it's really good once we get into January and really February. It'll take how cold it typically gets, but it doesn't take cold temperatures in late fall nor spring. And so with a lot of our Norway maples and that, the real damage comes to them in the fall as they're preparing for winter, and in the spring when they're coming out of winter. Now, true enough, if we get a minus 35 day, even in midwinter, that will kill them. So we have had record colds that killed them in midwinter, but it's our falls and our springs that are most responsible for winter injury, but not completely. Here's a plant we keep trying to grow in South Dakota. I wish we'd quit. It's the big leaf hydrangeas. This would be the endless summer hydrangeas, for example, called endless summer because they bloom off new and old wood. They bloom beginning of the season and blooms continue till the end of the season, hence the name endless summer. Notice it's a zone 6 plant. Well, with zone 6, it doesn't do too well, and why it can be a beautiful plant. I mean, if it's in a pot, it's gorgeous. Unfortunately, when you plant them out, they end up looking like this. And this is in McCory Gardens. They literally die to the ground every year and then have to re-sprout because the roots survive the winter, but the top doesn't, and they just sprout. So it's kind of an end of summer hydrangea. So we do have plants that clearly just are not hardy enough to tolerate not only our falls and our springs, but our winters as well. And this is one of them. Now, I've seen some beauties. There's some nice ones, but I had to go a little ways to see them. I'm in the highlands of Peru, where it doesn't get that cold, and there they just do fantastic. But when I was also in Peru, I went to their botanical garden, and they had Thuya occidentalis, our American arborvitae, and they looked sad. Now, they looked sad not because it was too cold or that the fall and spring had too much temperature fluctuations. It was the fact the summers were too hot and the plants didn't do well there. And that's the other part we often forget about. A good example here is on my own campus. Viburnums do not like hot, droughty sites. In fact, when I'm looking at shelter belts and they've planted the American cranberry bush viburnum or the wayfaring tree, which is a viburnum, And they plant those out in rows on dry soils, and then they wonder why they're dead in 5 years. They should be. And by the way, I might add, that's the same with dogwoods. Dogwoods do not like dry, droughty soils, and they often get cankers and fail. You know, the plants for the drier soils tend to be ones such as lilacs. But this, on my own campus, the lines there signify this is a building on the north side of these plants that's almost all glass. And so the sun comes down during the summer, reflects off that building, and you can almost fry an egg on that patio surface. And they planted a line of the wayfaring trees, all right, the viburnums. Every one of them was dead within 4 years. And they died not because of the cold, and nor did they die because of drought, because the area is watered. They died because of the summer heat. And if we think about trees and what they need, the ideal temperature, summer temperature now, for trees between 68 and 86 degrees. And I want you to consider this. Every day the temperature is above 86 degrees, your trees are going backwards. They are literally not operating at optimum anymore. They've already bypassed that sweet spot. Yes, they're manufacturing food, but they're using far more of that in respiration. In other words, they're not doing as well. And when you think of all the days we've experienced this year with temperatures in the 90s or the 100s, all right, that is tremendous stress on our trees during the summer months. You know, at higher temperatures, net photosynthesis begins to decline. In other words, how much food the tree actually gets to keep. Why? Because respiration, both the photo and dark respiration, increases. So the plant is utilizing more and more of the food it manufactures through photosynthesis into just surviving in its respiration. So it actually has less food to utilize for other processes and less food to put away in a rainy day fund. In other words, they're highly stressed. And usually we combine heat with drought, right? And with drought, what happens? Well, the stomates close. The plant is going to reduce the amount of water it's losing. Well, when it reduces the amount of water it's losing by closing those stomates, that also means it's not going to be able to take up carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is the building block for photosynthesis. So under hot, droughty conditions, the plant is not manufacturing a lot of additional food beyond what it takes to keep it alive. And even there, it might have shortfalls. The other thing, of course, is you're not giving up moisture. That leaf is going to heat up more, no different than the mechanism we have to cool ourselves, which is sweating. And so the combination of heat and drought, and quite often it's hard to separate one from the other, is a stress we don't really think about, but it was a major stress this summer. I'm already seeing color changes on maples. I'm getting people contacting me and saying, you know what, I looked out there and my maples are turning color. Now, the maple you're looking at here, which is starting to get some color changes, this was occurring about 2 weeks ago. These were all planted this spring and they tried to water them. The leaves aren't wilting per se, but the plant is certainly in distress and it's coloring. So right now, premature fall color is a warning, not a display that we should say, wow, that's great. I'm glad I'm seeing fall color for it. And we're seeing a lot more scorch. This is a Korean maple. I'm just happen to have 2 examples of maples. Some of the leaves are even getting a little crinkly along the margins, but you can see a lot of spotting in these leaves. And what's happening is the leaf temperatures are getting so high, we're actually just scorching, drying out the material. Some trees are more susceptible to this than others. Some of these maples are certainly susceptible to this sort of damage. And so I'm getting more and more samples in where the margins of the leaf are turning crisp, the margins. Usually the area farthest from the veins, which are bringing water into the leaves, are where you're going to see this damage first. And again, lots of samples of this summer as well. And for our spruce, and I had several calls on this today. If you get a spruce that the interior needles are already turning color, now, by the way, they will do that in the fall anyway as they shed. But I'm already seeing that occurring in a lot of spruce, that you'll look in and the tips are still green or bluish green, depending on the species, but they're starting to get some major color changes in the interior. And of course, they're asking, well, what do they spray? Well, the only thing you spray is H2O, and you spray it along the ground. That's really what they need. And I'm willing to bet if we get a sunny, dry fall, you're going to see the natural shedding of these interior leaves turn almost a golden yellow before they fall. And it would be normal for them to lose their 5-year-old needles or 6-year-old needles. But considering a drought, they might start losing their 2nd and 3rd-year needles as well. And that's certainly going to be a stress as well. Well, we can't do much about the heat. There's no way you can do anything about a 110-degree day. But if we can keep them hydrated, and we do have that under our control, that will help reduce the stress. Certainly won't eliminate it. And this is a good example. Look at these spruce, and these spruce are west and north of Pierre in South Dakota, which is an area that is experiencing moderate drought this year. And these trees look fine. Well, the reason they look fine is well maintained, but look at this. Every tree or shrub in this belt received 2 gallons per hour water through a trickle irrigation system for 12 hours a week. In other words, every plant got 24 gallons of water a week. Now, that may sound like a lot. The plants are actually using quite a bit more than that. But by having that going down, that was keeping them from being overly stressed. Now, certainly the temperatures alone are going to be a stress on these plants, but we can't do much about that. But we can water. And I see more and more of these trickle irrigations going in windbreaks. And they certainly pay off in long-term plant survival. And as a reminder to everybody, what do we want to see as water? And this would be for your ornamentals as well. This would be for young, newly planted ornamentals. This would not apply to a major shade tree or that, so it's our smaller ones. A gallon of water for every inch caliber. So you measure the tree about 6 inches above the ground. And if it's 1 inch in diameter at 6 inches above the ground, it's going to need a gallon of water at each watering. And you water them daily for 2 weeks after you planted them, and then every other day for a month. In other words, if I went out to a shelter belt, newly planted shelter belt, smaller material, that would translate to about a pint of water. In the perfect world, they get a pint of water every day for the first 2 weeks, and then every other day for the remainder of the month. I know that's impractical in a lot of cases, but where people have trickle irrigation are able to do that, the survival is far better than some of the belts I saw this year where they were not getting even measurable rain for a month after planting. And there the mortality would be high. But another thing we ought to consider is that temperature. And what they've developed is a heat sum map. In other words, a map that looks at temperatures during the summer. So we have a hardiness zone map for winter. We're in zone 4. But now we also have a map that takes into account the summer temperatures. And what they do is they look at the number of days that an area has temperatures above 86 degrees. Because again, days where the temperature is above 86 degrees are stress for our trees. Good example. This is a balsam fir surviving, certainly not growing, in Faith, South Dakota, and it's living on faith, I assure you. This particular plant is in hardiness zone 3 to 5. Well, certainly then in Faith, South Dakota, which is zone 4, it should survive based upon the winter temperatures. But it's a heat sum zone for 7 to 14 days of temperatures above 86 degrees. It's actually trying to grow in heat sum zone 7, which is 60 to 90 days of temperatures of 86 degrees and higher. We really need to start utilizing this heat sum map a little bit more when we're selecting plant materials, because just based upon hardiness, which seems to be the single thing people use, we all do, quite honestly, you would say, well, this would be a perfectly fine tree for that area. It's not. And it's not because it's not getting enough water per se. It's just, quite frankly, it's just too darn hot for it. It's not adapted to that hot environment. And this year, it's been incredibly hot for all trees. Look at this. This is bare root. In other words, a tree put into the ground with no soil around it. The buds had not opened yet. and it was planted in early July. In other words, it had remained in a cooler and a shed until then and was out and planted in early July. 90-degree temperatures during leaf out is going to give you 60% mortality of the leaves on that tree. And it was almost 100% on these trees. In other words, if you go in to look at this tree planting project, and the name of the town will remain unnamed, but they planted all these trees bare root early July, and I came back about a week and a half later and took this picture, and every tree tried to leaf out in 90-degree temperatures, and it caused a lot of damage. Now, as a reminder, we can sometimes get those 90-degree temperatures in April. So sometimes what we find, we're planting bare root stock and it doesn't do very well. It's because we got abnormally high temperatures, and the temperatures alone can be a problem in April. And that can do damage that we often forget about because we don't think about those few warm days that we might have experienced then. But heat kills. Another one here, look at this. White spruce seedlings suffer 50% damage when exposed to 118 degrees for 30 minutes. That spruce was certainly hitting that. When I was measuring those hot days where it was getting to 110 degrees, you measure those needles off that black fabric, you were hitting 120, 125 degrees. And it was certainly staying that for more than 30 minutes. So I've seen damage this year on shelter belts that were either planted this year or last year or even 2 years ago. The seedlings are still small on evergreens, and the whole problem was heat. They just were exposed to too high temperatures to which they're not well adapted to, and white spruce would be an example of that. Well, what about pests? What about pests for our trees and shrubs and climate? What impact do we have there? Now, we've already done a webinar on pine wilt disease, so people can go back and refer to that if they want. But Austrian pine was planted a lot in the state, as well as Scots pines. Why? They're well adapted to our states. They can take our coldest winters. They can take our hottest summers, but they can't take this disease of pine wilt. And pine wilt is caused by a small nematode. The nematode is native to North America, does not affect our North American pines. Ponderosa pines are not affected by it. They might be infected with it, but they're not affected by it. In other words, the nematode may be present, but it's not causing them any harm. But on our Austrian and Scots pines, 2 pines that we planted because they are well adapted to our climate, unfortunately are succumbing to this particular nematode, and we are losing them across the entire state. Now, if you look at this map, and I go into more detail of this in that earlier webinar, you'll notice that it gradually has moved north in the state. And you think, well, why would that be? I mean, if it's going to kill our exotic pines, Austrian, why didn't it kill them all at once? Why did it have to slowly move north? Well, why is it a problem now? Our summers are getting warmer, and this nematode needs warm summers to kill the tree. In other words, if it's a cool summer, the nematode may be present, but it's not able to kill the tree. So what we need is high temperatures, days above about 76 degrees, the mean temperature, and that is from day and night. And if you look at this, look at Aberdeen, South Dakota, where it appeared about 2 years ago. I mean, it's been in Yankton for several decades. But if you look at the 1990s and the 2020s, look at how many more days we're above that 76-degree threshold. A lot. And that goes from June to July to August. So not only experiencing warmer winters, but we're also experiencing warmer summers. And those warmer summers are allowing some of our pests to actually do better. In other words, be more efficient killers. And this is why pine wilt disease is now found throughout the entire state of South Dakota, where 30 years ago it was only found at the very southern edge. Why? Because their summers are getting warmer as well. They're getting above that 76-degree threshold for longer time periods. What about emerald ash borer? Once again, we did an entire webinar just on this insect, so I won't go over the details, but And certainly in South Dakota, we have streets entirely lined with ash, which are going to succumb to this insect. We're going to see more communities that are looking like this. And we are finding more communities, however, they still remain in that Lincoln, Minnehaha County. But nevertheless, it's going to continue to spread, and we're going to have more communities that you look at their downtown, and it's going to look like this. Well, what's interesting is this particular insect, which is native throughout that entire dashed area, came from that, I'll call it red area of China. In other words, they went back and did the genetics, and our winters are a little colder than the particular emerald ash borer that arrived here likes. In other words, it's not as hardy, not well adapted to the cold as some of its northern cousins, which did not get over here yet, thank goodness. And if we get a cold snap, we're going to kill a bunch of them. The ideal is we can lose 99% of them at minus 30. Now, by the way, that translates to about minus 35 because air temperature, because the bark will provide that much insulation. And we have had a couple of those time periods. I mean, 2019 was a good one. It got cold enough, it literally killed the insect. And my knife is pointing to one that literally dried up and died in the fall, because we got a real cold snap in the fall. And once again, they're susceptible as well. If we don't hit minus 25, or we kill 80% of them, it really doesn't matter what we killed. Losing 80% of them, that population is still going to grow. It's just not going to grow as fast. So unfortunately, our weather is not cold enough. Now, back in the 2018 to 2019, where we did hit minus 25 at the end of January, it killed a lot of them up in the canopy where there's not a lot of thick bark, but killed very few in the trunks. And overall, it looked like we lost about 30% of them in trees overall. That's barely going to change it. North Dakota may see it different. Canada certainly has up in Manitoba that they are getting enough winter mortality. All right, it's cold enough, long enough in their winter still, that it is slowing the spread. For us, it's a little bit of help, but unfortunately with our warmer winters, generally warmer winters, it's actually to the benefit of this insect. So our warmer summers helping pine wilt disease, which is killing our pines, our exotic pines. Our warmer winters are helping emerald ash borer kill all our ash. And again, it's just not getting cold enough. Now, with emerald ash borer, a good reminder is that as we're losing the ash, a lot of people are planting maples, and maples have their own pest problems as well. And I did want to mention that, you know what, we need to stop really focusing on maples. I'm not saying we shouldn't plant them, but we've overplanted them. And because of that, I think we need to slow down, and we got to consider this. Our winters are a little warmer, our summers are a little warmer, and we're experiencing greater seasonal fluctuations. And because of that, I just want to mention a couple plants, touch upon them, and we'll have a whole episode on tree selection. But just to point out some of our thinking, we need to plant more trees that shut down early and wake up late. We don't want plants that break bud too early or hold their leaves too late, because they're going to be the most vulnerable to these seasonal fluctuations. And again, we have to consider the winter temperatures and the summer temperatures. So just to give you a couple examples, the Ohio buckeye. Now there's a tree that's drought tolerant and it shuts down early. It does not hold its leaves much into October, and it wakes up kind of late. Because of that, it's fairly well adapted to our climate and the extremes you're going to see. And it's a nice tree, has these very colorful flowers. It does produce a rather awful fruit, the buckeye, if you will, and squirrels seem to enjoy it, but there's nothing we're going to do with it. So, I mean, in town, you could plant cultivars. And autumn splendor is probably the one you see the most out there available. It's a nice tree. There's an example on campus. Now, by the way, you won't see that scorching or summer heat either. That tree, every leaf is just as green as could be, and it's not receiving any supplemental watering at all. And I've been very impressed with this tree in terms of its performance in South Dakota during our hot summers, cold winters, and our drought. Another one that people know I like is Kentucky coffee tree, and for good reasons. It's drought tolerant. I've seen some wonderful survival in bare root stock during this heat and drought year that we're having. It's very heat tolerant as well, which surprised a lot of people. It shuts down early, right? Its leaves are going to drop soon and it wakes up late. It doesn't start breaking bud until May. So it's a tree that's extremely well adapted to our current climate as well as the climate we expect to have in the future. And by the way, another reason I like it, there's not a lot of them out there. So we don't see a lot of pest problems. And it's a nice tree. Attractive flowers to it. Leaves are kind of nice, though they kind of hang on a little bit long as a stick. Now, a lot of people don't like this tree because it can produce fruit. There are male and female coffee trees, and they've gone to planting males, but I am going to give you a little bit of a warning. Espresso is a male cultivar. It will not produce fruit, and nobody can figure out any value to this fruit, but there's an espresso covered in fruit. And I see this more and more. I'd be kind of cautious on assuming that you bought a cultivar of coffee tree that will not produce fruit that is a male. I see more and more of these where a few here and there, not every one of them, but a few here and there will still produce pods. So if you don't like the pods, I just say not to plant them. And I'll admit there's not much you're going to do with the pods. You can make coffee out of it. You'll never drink it. Honey locust. Now, honey locust is an unusual case. Drought tolerant, heat tolerant, cold hardy, shuts down early. It's doing everything we want if you buy this cultivar, Northern Acclaim, which was released from North Dakota State University, and I think is one of their better ones they've released. And they have a lot of great ones, but this one is truly just a winner. And the reason for that is a lot of the other cultivars are actually damaged by our winters. If it gets a little cold, particularly in the fall and the spring, and remember, I mentioned earlier, we saw a lot of damage on them this year, but we didn't see them on the Northern Acclaim. But we did see them on the other cultivars. And the other problem is you'll see nectaria canker. Why? Because a lot of the older cultivars that are not used to temperature fluctuations, you'll find some dead tissue forming around branch unions, and that's where the canker gets in and causes dieback. Oaks. Most of the oaks that we have out there, you can't go wrong with. Heritage is one that I like, but I like bur oak too, of course. Drought tolerant, heat tolerant, shuts down early, and they can tolerate alkalinity. At least some of them can. Anything that's a bur oak can. A bur oak or an English can. So I'm going to wrap it up with this. And that is, we need to consider soils. And the only one I'll touch upon with soils for today is chlorosis. This is a red maple. Yes, a red maple growing in Phillips, South Dakota on a soil with a pH near 8. It's that alkaline. And the problem with that is the tree can survive and survive the climate there. But what it can't survive is its inability to absorb sufficient amount of micronutrients. What happens is they're in the soil, but the plant can't utilize them because the high pH makes them unavailable to the plant. In other words, they're not soluble. They're not in the water stream. The plant does not recognize them, cannot absorb them and utilize them for its growth. So you could check the soil and the nutrients, as we often call them, or elements, would be present, but not available to the plant. And just as a reminder, in our alkaline soils, by those with pHs above 7.3, you're often going to find some trees suffering from chlorosis, which means yellowing leaves, green veins. Iron deficiencies are common on birches, particularly river birch, and on oaks, with the exception of our bur oak or any English bur cross, such as heritage. But on swamp white oak, certainly on our pin oaks and that, or our northern red oak, on alkaline soils, they will turn yellow. And our river birch will turn yellow, as well as our gray birch. What we do to correct that in urban areas is we provide them with iron. With maples, it's manganese. It can be manganese and iron, so they need both in some cases. And I'll give you an example. I went out and just analyzed the leaves on this maple tree, and what we found was 122 parts per million of iron and 235 parts per million of manganese. As I mentioned, manganese is what maples are often deficient in. What the leaves need, and there was a great study looking at what we should be able to find in various tree species, is 160 of iron and 525 of manganese. We're fairly close in the iron. We're way off in the manganese. In other words, if a company just said, we're going to add iron to this tree, it's still going to be chlorotic. And that's what a lot of tree companies have seen. This one needs iron and manganese, and it clearly needs manganese to help correct that deficiency. And of course, the best way to avoid these problems is check the pH before you make planting decisions. So let me end with this. Best trees to plant, ones your neighbors don't have. We don't want to overpopulate the landscape with elms as we did, or with ash as we did, or with maples as we're doing. All fine trees, but susceptible to various pests. So let's get a little bit more diversity out there, and that'll be a future webinar. Trees that leaf out late and drop early. Why? Because they can withstand our temperature fluctuations. And so my recommendation is make sure that you're selecting trees that are zone 4 or lower. As I mentioned earlier, zone 3 trees are going to shut down even earlier and wake up even later. If you're choosing plants hardy to zone 3, you have plants that'll be better tolerant of our temperature fluctuations. And then we ought to start considering looking more at our heat sum zones. And in South Dakota, because of our summers that are warm and getting warmer, ideally you'd be looking at plants that can tolerate heat zone 7 or higher. In other words, 7, 8, or 9. If you can find trees, and there's not a long list of them, that are hardy to zone 3, but then also heat sum 9, you've got a plant that can take our coldest winter as well as fluctuations and our hottest summer. It doesn't matter how long it is hot. So we need to start utilizing a little bit more information to making our planting decisions. How cold the winter is, yes, but our seasonal fluctuations and how hot our summers are, because we're probably going to see more of that in the future. And then finally, we always have to look at alkalinity of our soils, which is a concern. And too often planting decisions are made without the benefit of checking pH. And there's, particularly in windbreaks, where you're not going to be able to modify the soils or go out and inject the trees with iron and or manganese. We really need to watch that to make sure we're selecting plants that are tolerant of that. And so with that, I thank everyone for paying attention on this one. Part 2 of this will be next month, and we're going to talk about herbicide injury. That's always a big issue, how to recognize it, what caused problems, as well as the issue with carryover. In other words, it was corn this year. What herbicides were used in that corn, which might mean you can't plant next year, as well as problems with Bambi and rabbits. So that'll kind of focus on next time. But with that, I'm going to stop sharing here, and I will turn it back to Tony, our host and moderator, and ask him, do we have any questions that we need to consider here as we're wrapping things up?
Thanks, Dr. Ball. I don't see any questions in the chat right now. Maybe there are some being typed, but friendly reminder to anybody who has yet to put their SAF or ISA credentials in the chat box, please add those before you leave. I do have a question from Aaron. What product are you recommending for chlorosis? Are there any specific products out there?
Well, we always stay away from recommending specific products, but I will say there's a number of national companies out there that do provide products. I will mention 2 just as examples, not as endorsements or criticisms of others. ArborJet and Rainbow both have these elements available in a form that they can inject, and I have seen them work amazingly fast in correcting these deficiencies, and they're going to be injected about every 3 years. It's far better to do a trunk injection following the label recommendations. I might mention Arbor Systems also has an injectable product. And these will correct it for about 3 years, and then you'll have to do it again. Merely spraying the leaves is not enough, and our soils are so alkaline, it's difficult to put enough of the element in a form that's available to them.
Great. I had another question pop up. Is there any treatment for Nectria canker?
Really none other than pruning. And if you can prune it before it actually gets into the trunk, you can get it before it starts damaging. The best way to avoid the Nectria cankers is to make sure you're planting trees such as honey locusts that are hardy enough to our area, that they're not going to get that little bit of winter damage that allows the Nectria canker to get in. Other than that, taking a look at them in spring and pruning out any dead and dying branches so you can prevent the disease from entering the trunk is really our only measure.
I have another question pop up. Is it wise to trim an arborvitae, a very tall tree, hoping to trim the top so the wind or snow does not break it?
Yes, but you can shear them, but you can't shear them beyond the green. They don't resprout very, very well. What a lot of people do to keep them from splitting, which they frequently do, is wire them for the winter. In other words, connecting the stems, and usually they're doing it with manila ropes. When I say wiring, I just mean the system rather than the metal wire, and hold them together to keep them from splitting, then remove that string in the spring. So I know people that just kind of wrap them and you don't really see it, but that'll hold them together, and then in the spring of the year you can remove it. But if you have some dead areas, you can shear that, but never shear arborvitaes beyond green. They will not resprout vigorously like some other plants will.
Great advice. I have one more question so far.
Sure.
Does that northern acclaim honey locust get the Nectria canker?
I'm certain that it could get the canker. I don't know of any tests that have shown that it's particularly resistant to it. I will just say it's unlikely to, and the reason being it does not experience the winter injuries that the others do. So there's not providing an entry point for the disease. So in my experience, it has proven to be a good tree for avoiding the cankers.
Wonderful. Well, that's all the questions in the chat box for now. Thank you, Dr. Ball, for your time. Thanks, everybody, for your participation and joining us. Join us next month for part 2 of Abiotic Stressors in Trees. A flyer for registration will be out in the coming weeks here. So stay tuned. Thanks very much and have a great day.